Well, hello. For those of you who have come to Rocky Watch the last few times, thank you. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. So, listen, today's talk is by Lucy Hornby, and she's a fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. She has lived in China for 20 years and most recently served as the deputy bureau chief in Beijing for the Financial Times. So she's worked with the Financial Times and she's worked with Reuters on topics like elite politics, trade wars, and environmental pollution. So she first moved to China as a teacher of English in Wuhan and worked for this project called Princeton in Asia, which was designed to bridge gaps and bridge relationships between China and the US. Today, she will just look at the great questions we will be facing between the relationship between China and the US when coronavirus finally ebbs. So take it away, Lucy. We are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you also, Sadhana. I am very pleased to be here and honored to be part of such a distinguished series of speakers. And I'm also very pleased to see that so many people have taken time out of their day to join us for this talk. What the coronavirus will do to the US-China relationship is a pretty big topic. We only have 20 minutes. So I think I'm going to start where the coronavirus started, which is Wuhan. Now, Laura, we've got a second. Here we go. So just a quick introduction for those of you who had not heard of Wuhan before January of this year, and you would probably be the majority of people in this world. Wuhan is a city bang in the middle of China. It's the X that you can see on the map, and it's surrounded by Hubei province, which is where the majority of the outbreak in China happened. After January of this year, China effectively locked down Hubei province and contained the virus outbreak in that province. Wuhan is where the railway from Beijing to Guangzhou crosses the Yangtze River. It's a center, an industrial city. It's a center for the automotive industry. They're trying to develop new tech there. It's beastly hot in the summer and it's chilly and rainy all winter. So it's a perfect place for a virus to spread among a population. Now, I had heard of Wuhan before this all happened because I was teaching there in 1995. I've got a picture here of Wuhan in happier days. And when I was there, one question that would come up almost all the time when you met somebody was, 中国好还是美国好? Which means, which is better, China or the US? And I think at the time, it was very clear to most of the people who were asking that the quality of life and the governance that they saw in the US was better than what they had in Wuhan. I've got a picture here of my classroom in Wuhan. This was a university classroom. You can see that the conditions were pretty basic. But China changed very quickly over the last 20, 25 years. A second picture in the middle is of a crowd in Wuhan in 2009. Which is when China really began closing the gap with the US in terms of quality of life for its citizens. Everybody has the funny glasses because they're looking at a solar eclipse. And finally, down on the lower right-hand corner, you can see three young women walking through the streets of Wuhan today. It's a picture that was taken by my colleague at Reuters, Ali Song. And these young women probably don't differ in lifestyle very much from young women their age in America or anywhere else. They're middle-class people who have a lot in common with the middle classes in the rest of the world. So in that sense, the old question of, which is better is one that I think can be, that gap is not so obvious to most people in China these days. In some ways, they would even say that China has closed the gap with the US, particularly when it comes to transport and infrastructure. China and most of East Asia has modern infrastructure. They come to the US and they're pretty appalled at how dinky and rusty and old a lot of our infrastructure looks. But there's one area that I think in the US-China sort of relatives' positions to each other that China still admired, and that was US governance. So when this mystery virus first cropped up, when doctors first identified it in Wuhan in December of 2019, the doctors and the scientists wasted no time to reaching out to their counterparts internationally. They wanted to spread the alarm. They didn't trust their own government to respond appropriately. And for a lot of January, it looked like they were right. Wuhan was a mess. The virus was spreading, factions were fighting, the government was trying to downplay it, the hospital systems were quickly overwhelmed. And then China instituted this draconian system of lockdown on all of Hubei province and strict controls for the rest of the country. And the rest of the world suddenly sat up and paid attention to what was happening in Wuhan. And at that point, hang on a second, I'm having some trouble. Oh, there we go. At that point, I don't know if you can see it, but this quote says, it's from Henry Kissinger, and it says, when the COVID-19 pandemic is over, many countries' institutions will be perceived as having failed. So in this narrative, we're now in late January, early February 2020. And I think to many people in China who are very angry at what their government was doing, the country whose institutions had failed appeared to be China. But that was then, this is now. So what happened? Back in January, Chinese President Xi Jinping needed the US, the UK, the World Health Organization to endorse China's approach to containing the virus. But by March, many Chinese citizens who had been angry at their own government's response were appalled to see that these other countries were fumbling even worse. They saw the chaos, they saw the hospital systems also being overwhelmed, they saw the confusing messages coming out of the top, they saw the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, actually catching the virus and in a very serious way. And by April, China declared victory over the virus at home and began promoting its model abroad. I think it's fair to say that many middle-class Chinese felt that their country had actually done a better job than the other countries that in the past they might have thought had better governance. So the first area that I think we need to consider when we look at what the coronavirus has done to the relative strengths of the US and China is in ideology. And the question that I think a lot of people are asking, especially in China, is did the authoritarian government respond better? And if they did, who should the Chinese middle class look up to? And how about the middle class in the rest of the world? Since the Second World War, the US and the Western countries have promoted democracy as being a system that results in better governance. And since the Second World War, middle class people around the world, and especially in China, have responded pretty well to that argument. But I think that this coronavirus, the biggest thing that has changed is it has called into question that assertion. And it has given a lot of credibility to the response of the authoritarian governments, in particular China. Now, I'm talking here about perceptions. We don't know in the end who will have done better, but at the moment, in the perceptions, I think that we have to admit that the coronavirus has been a huge blow for the argument that democracy gives good governance around the world. Now, on the topic of geopolitics, where does the coronavirus leave us? I think there are two areas in geopolitics where China's position will end up being much stronger thanks to the coronavirus. One of those is in Europe. So Eastern and Southern Europe have been for some time peeling away from the European Union and from NATO. And the coronavirus has only accelerated this process. In January and February, when China was struggling massively to contain the virus, there was this huge effort by Chinese citizens and Chinese corporations around the world to source and return medical supplies to China so that China would have enough. And that left a lot of the rest of the world completely exposed when the virus arrived on their own shores. China has used this very adroitly. They've come back with what we call mask diplomacy. They're offering aid and masks. It's not always clear that the aid or the masks that they're offering is greater than what the Chinese sourced from these countries in the past. And the other thing is a lot of these countries are buying equipment that then is being portrayed as aid. But nonetheless, the perception is very clear. The perception is that China is there, China has the supplies, and China is there to help when the wealthier European nations are struggling with their own crisis and are unable to help the weaker European nations. And I think it's very clear that this will only accelerate the split away from a unified Europe of Southern and Eastern Europe. And for the US, that's a real loss because Europe has been a partner with the US, again, since the Second World War in many of the projects that the US has done around the world. The other area where I think there will be a geopolitical impact is in the Pacific. So the US Navy was also very overstretched well before the coronavirus began. But this picture here of Captain Crozier of the USS Roosevelt is kind of became emblematic of the Navy's vulnerabilities in the face of this disease. Captain Crozier asked for more help when his ship was the site of a raging infection. He was fired instead. And this very public fallout, I think, brings home to everybody how overstretched the US Navy is in the Pacific. The results, I think, will be very clear. China will tighten its grip on the South China Sea, and it's probably going to start exerting a stronger presence, especially in the island regions of the Western Pacific that China believes are vital for its own security and defense. So those are the areas where I think the coronavirus has resulted in a clear increase of Chinese power and decrease in the US relative position in just a few short months. Now, some other areas. Global institutions. Again, since the Second World War, the US hasn't just operated alone. It's relied on a series of global institutions such as the UN, the World Trade Organization, and the World Health Organization to try to promote the kind of governance and values that we hope to have here at home. Now, that has also been really called into question by the coronavirus. The WHO seemed to take at face value China's assertions about the virus. In January, they parroted China's line. They weren't actually allowed into China to inspect until February. And when they were allowed into China, they did so under very controlled circumstances. And they basically endorsed the Chinese response. This has resulted in the Trump administration threatening to cut off funding to the WHO. And I think it's just emblematic of the fact that in many ways, these international institutions have been undermined by China, but the US doesn't have a better response other than threatening to cut off their funding. Without these international institutions, it's also a clear reduction in the ability of the US to promote the kind of governance and the kind of system that we've come to take for granted. But on the other hand, China doesn't really have an alternative in terms of institutions that could take the place of these institutions. Other areas where the coronavirus has definitely impacted the US-China power balance. One of those is in Northeast Asia. So the countries in Northeast Asia with a great deal of distrust of China, they were some of the earlier countries to act to respond to the coronavirus. Taiwan in particular has used the coronavirus to try to up its international profile. And I think Japan and South Korea will continue to want to keep the US on side in order to balance Chinese power in the region. It's also important to say that while the Navy, the coronavirus really revealed the weaknesses of the US Navy, the US Army did enact COVID measures very early in South Korea and seems to have done a bit better. So there's an area in Northeast Asia where it hasn't been as clear a win for China, or the coronavirus hasn't as obviously strengthened China as it has in Europe or in the island Pacific, as I mentioned earlier. Another area where I think the coronavirus's impact is very obvious, but we'll have to wait a while to see what happens, is in the question of supply chains. So the US corporations have had a strategy of offshoring, especially to China, but also elsewhere in the world. And the coronavirus has really highlighted the vulnerabilities of that strategy when it comes to national security and health security and security of supply back in the US. This is a famous picture of the Patriots jet that was sent to collect tons of masks and other supplies from China for Boston area hospitals. But I think that vulnerability and that dependence has really been brought home to many Americans and also many American corporations. It's been a main It's been a main priority to emphasize that by the Trump administration, but corporations and the public had been skeptical until now. Whether that results in longer term changes, I don't know. But if it does, I think it will help shore up US security of supply, and it would probably help staunch the way supply chains had concentrated within China over the last 20 years or so. Now, other countries have not failed to note the impact of the coronavirus when it comes to our commercial relationships. Countries like Vietnam, on the upper left here, you see a ceremony where the Vietnamese were offering aid to Italy after the coronavirus. On the right-hand side is a Chinese press conference in South Africa. And China has made a big deal of how much it is helping Africa and other poor countries with the medical supplies needed to help fight the coronavirus. Taiwan, as I mentioned, has really stepped up. It's also engaging in mask diplomacy. And underneath all this jostling for commercial relationships or the commercial supply chain is also a jostling for influence. And I think that we're going to see that jostling continue between the US, between China, between other countries who are competing with China, and especially in places like Africa, Eastern Europe, South Asia, and the Middle East. And along with that jostling, I think we're going to see a real rise in fake news. Especially in Africa, the amount of fake news that's sweeping through the African social media is pretty impressive. But I think it's going to end up being a sort of strategic ground where the US and China will try to jostle, raising local tensions probably. So that's not a clear area where the US or China wins, so to speak, but I think it's very clearly an area where the coronavirus has affected the way the US and China's commercial rivals portray themselves on the world stage. Now, a final note, and that is so far, I think most of what my evaluation is at this point, which is in the middle of May, is that the coronavirus has probably been a boon for China. It has raised China's profile. It has put out the impression that China was able to capably respond to this disease. It has also given the impression that the US was not able to capably respond, and that the US was not able to capably support smaller countries around the world. So the reason I love this photo, and the reason I decided to end with it, is that this is the first visit of Xi Jinping to Wuhan 2 months after the virus first started raging through Wuhan. And I just find it so interesting and almost absurd. You know, here you have a person who's in a conference room with a mask, waving at a long distance to another person who's on a screen and also masked. And for me, this picture really symbolizes the degree of control that China has needed to have and the degree of precautions in order to control the virus in the way it did, effectively blocking it within a single province and then squelching it within that province. The rest of China, unlike the rest of the world, has basically not been exposed to the coronavirus at all. Here in the US, I know lots of people who've gotten it, but most of the people I know in China don't know anybody who's gotten it. And in order to maintain that level of protection from the virus, they're going to have to maintain a level of social control and a level of control on international interactions that we really haven't seen in China for a good 25 years or more. And so whether that will turn out in the long run to be a liability, I'm not sure, but I think it will certainly mean that China is stepping onto this larger role in the world stage in a situation where they are also having to double down on their degree of domestic control. And I think that opens up a lot of questions for the future for how long they'll be able to sustain that role and whether they'll be able to take on a more global leadership role, whether they'll be able to capitalize on the benefits that the coronavirus has given them, or whether they'll find themselves hamstrung by their own need for control. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Sadhana and Joanne for the questions, and I look forward to hearing them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was so interesting. That's There's a lot to think about there. I just wanted to take a minute to remind people that you can ask questions in one of two ways. You can virtually raise your hand by clicking on the participants button at the bottom, and we hope some of you will take advantage of that, because we find that it makes for a more interactive and lively event. But the questions are coming in chat. Let me get you started with one of those. To what extent do you believe the numbers put forth by China are reliable? How much has China tested its affected populations?
Okay, so I think that the numbers coming out of Wuhan, we have to assume were an undercount. Probably there were a much greater extent of asymptomatic or low symptom people in Wuhan than were reflected in any Chinese numbers. And there may also have been more deaths. In fact, there probably were more deaths than were reflected in Chinese numbers. In a way, it's good news because if there were more people who were impacted in Wuhan with a lower death rate, then that would be in line with what we've seen in other countries where the virus is not quite as fatal as we had initially assumed based on the early Chinese numbers. I think the question, the subtext between your question is, how much do we trust that China isn't covering up some sort of an outbreak elsewhere? And, you know, that's a question a lot of people have wrestled with. I think that the answer is there may well be outbreaks in closed circumstances that we don't know of, for instance, in prisons maybe, or in within the military, for instance. But I think that we can have pretty good confidence that there haven't been widespread transmission in the broader Chinese population outside of Hubei. How do we know that? Because we just haven't seen the kind of medical breakdown in anywhere else that we would have if it was spreading in the rest of China the way it's been spreading elsewhere in the world. So circumstantially, I think at the moment, China's claims that they've contained it within Hubei are probably correct. In the future, if there were to be a future breakout, again, I think that we wouldn't necessarily know if it was in a very contained circumstance, but it would be much harder to hide if it was spreading through the general population. And as we know from here, it can't spread through the general population without a certain number of people getting sick enough to require the medical treatment that would start to gain attention.
Okay, thank you. Someone else is asking, saying they don't think you mentioned the expulsion of a large number of foreign journalists from China in recent months, including Ms. Deng from the Wall Street Journal, who is doing some great reporting on the coronavirus from Wuhan. Do you think the US government can be more effective in advocating on this issue?
Yeah, so this was a real blow. To catch up those who didn't know, China expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters in February. It expelled 17 American reporters in March, including Chao Deng, who is a terrific reporter and was doing great work from Wuhan. And that was in retaliation for the Trump administration expelling a certain number of Chinese state-owned media from the US. So when it comes to the question of how can the US government advocate for it, I actually view this as kind of an own goal by the US administration. One thing that's not so well known is that there are at least 40 foreign journalists, not just American, but European, Asian, from around the world, who happened to be out of China when the coronavirus hit or who left with their families. And it's not very clear that many of them will be able to get back into China. Because their visas in some cases are expiring while they're overseas. And I would not be surprised if China uses this as an opportunity to overall reduce the foreign press corps in China. I think this is bad news for 2 reasons. First of all, it vastly decreases the visibility that other countries have on what's going on in China, including ourselves. And for this, like I say, I think it was extremely short-sighted of the White House to pick a fight with China over expelling journalists because we lose, right? We lose visibility into our greatest rival. I also think it's a very bad decision for China, however, because speaking as a foreign journalist who reported out of China for 20 years, we do a lot when it comes to humanizing China, humanizing the Chinese people. Many of us have a great fondness for the country, and many of us bend over backwards to try to get the Chinese point of view or what's happening in China or a fair version of what China is doing out so the rest of the world understands that. And I think that, you see that, right? You see that in the sympathy with which the rest of the world follows the adventures of the Chinese people. And if that is strictly replaced by pro-China propaganda, I think the amount of sympathy and tolerance of the rest of the world for China's very real problems will decrease very sharply. So I think China, they think we're kind of a pest, but we're actually a big help for China when it comes to getting its story heard. And so I think they really cut off their own feet as well when they made this move.
Okay, we have a question from Paul who wants to know, how does the coronavirus affect the possibility of military conflict between China and the United States, especially regarding North Korea and the South China Sea?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that surprised me is that I expected the coronavirus to be an occasion for the hawks in China to push for a more aggressive action in the South China Sea in particular. I thought that they would use this occasion to kind of cement their control and maybe even push the US a bit on the assumption that the US would be too distracted or too weakened to respond. We haven't seen that much. We have seen some movement for tighter control in the South China Sea. But, I think China's also extremely cautious, and they'd rather take an inch here, 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 and here than provoke an up and up clash, because when it comes down to a straight up clash, then the US numbers are still better. So I think they'd far rather gain territory in a slow way than provoke a very hostile response.
Okay, and Jim wants to know, how might the fallout from the coronavirus affect the dynamic between the Chinese government and American multinationals with major investments in China, such as Apple?
Yeah, so the coronavirus, as I mentioned, I think the coronavirus has really called into question the security of the supply chain. And that's something that has been a subject of great question already. The Trump administration came in with an explicit mandate against offshoring, and the trade war with China, a lot of that was engineered with a view to getting American companies not to put all their eggs in the China basket. And I think it's worth noting that many Japanese or Korean companies had already adopted what they call the China Plus One strategy of deliberately diversifying their supply chains away from China. I think the coronavirus may help certain companies think about that more, because up till now they had been quite resistant to the Trump administration's push on this front. On the other hand, their problem is that it's hard to compete with China. China has a pretty good infrastructure and a pretty good setup at the moment, and it also has a pretty large domestic market. So if you move part of your supply chain elsewhere, you have to go through the trouble of setting it up again, and then you're ending up trying to sell into China as well. So I think the coronavirus will accelerate a kind of parallel supply chain where basically multinationals end up setting up parallel supply chains, one to supply their American or Western market and one to supply their China market.
Okay. What do you think the Chinese leadership has learned from its handling and international reaction to the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan?
Well, I certainly think that they were caught off guard and had no idea what was going on at first. It was really interesting to watch them at the beginning and to watch, for instance, they allowed the Chinese media to report relatively freely from Wuhan. And that's usually a sign that the leadership doesn't trust that it's getting the right messages through its own chain of command. So when they release the controls on Chinese reporters, it's usually because they need that information that the Chinese reporters can provide. Unfortunately, there's every sign that Xi is using the coronavirus to double down on a sort of authoritarian bent. So kicking out the foreign reporters, for instance. As I said, yes, we're pesky, but we're also a valuable source of information, even to the Chinese leadership. They've doubled down on social controls. I think the coronavirus has a tendency to reinforce what you thought you already knew about which system was best. And I think that the way that China has responded and the way that it has contained the virus within China, nothing about that would say to China that the authoritarian response was not the correct one.
Okay, Luke has a question he'd like to answer. We've seen high-level officials in both countries blaming each other for causing the virus. Li Jianjiao in China and Trump insisting on calling it the Chinese virus at his rallies in the US. Also, much has been reported on attacks against foreigners in China and against Asian Americans in the US. What have you observed regarding rises in anti-Chinese sentiment in the US and anti-China sentiment in China among the general publics, and how might that impact bilateral relationship?
Okay, well, I think blaming each other is just a good cover for covering up your own mistakes, right? So the Chinese Foreign Ministry was trying to make the completely absurd claim that it was planted by the US military in Wuhan because they just wanted to, at the time, distract attention from what looked at the time their very messy handling of the crisis. Trump initially was very sympathetic towards China. He endorsed Xi Jinping's view. He repeated Xi Jinping's assurances that this was not a serious problem. But then he became very eager to blame China when our own fumbles became very apparent. So, you know, my personal opinion is you need to get your act in order, not blame the other folks for what you didn't do. When it comes to the public, yeah, I think that's a big risk. I mean, I know that many of my Asian American friends are really concerned that this geopolitical rivalry could spill into hostility towards Asian Americans. And Africans in China have also been on the receiving end of some very discriminatory treatment. And so actually have foreigners of all stripes, which is unusual. It's not a healthy development. It's not one that I want to see happening. But I think it is a real risk as the two countries get more and more prickly with each other. Those prejudices do tend to leak into the general public.
Do you believe that in the long game, China's handling of this pandemic will be a mechanism that they use to gain and exert more political and economic control over other countries, such as those in Africa? Or do you believe that this will prompt more world leaders to become more isolated with China / distrust China further, and in the process rely more on their respective countries? In other words, will more countries become isolationists with regard to China?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that basically boils down to the capacity of that country to be isolationist, right? So I think that the East Asian countries who do have, you know, very developed markets and robust supply chain experience probably will become more isolationist vis-a-vis China. I think that's a good point. But in Eastern Europe, in Italy in particular, you see absolutely the opposite happening. You see them becoming quite cravenly flattering of China and sort of throwing themselves on China's bosom, so to speak. And I think that the sort of disintegration of the European experiment will only be accelerated.
If the Chinese are successful developing a vaccine for COVID-19, how will their need to vaccinate their own people and the PR power of distributing to other countries play out? Or is there another calculus?
So that is a very interesting question. And that's one that's actually a hot topic in China, not regards the vaccine, but in the past when China has made a big deal about giving foreign aid to other countries, Chinese citizens tend to really resent that because, you know, China still has parts of China which are extremely poor. And so Chinese citizens very quickly are like, hey, you know, what are you doing? You're giving school buses to Serbia and we don't have school buses for our own kids. So if there were a vaccine that China did develop, I think that could be a very tricky thing to navigate domestically. The other thing you really need to keep in mind are the sheer numbers. So except for Hubei province, which is, I don't know, maybe 80 million, probably less, I don't know, something around 50, 60 million people, right? So it's a country-sized thing. But the rest of China has really not been exposed to this disease at all because of the draconian lockdown. So then the question would be, you've got, you know, 1.3 billion people who are completely unexposed. How do you make the calculus that you try to vaccine them Or do you vaccinate all the senior officials and then go around trying to get maximum PR value out of it? I think the tendency would be to do the latter. The tendency would be to try to get maximum PR value out of it in other countries. But there would be a real backlash within China if the foreign policy apparatus tried to do that.
We have someone who's curious to know your take on talk about a possible quote unquote Cold War breaking out between the US and China, especially in light of a recent report received by Xi Jinping from the MSS, as well as what seems like conflict / the spread of misinformation occurring in proxy countries, i.e., as you mentioned, in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we all think about history in terms of analogies, right? And so when you look at the disintegration in relations between China and the US over the last 3-4 years, maybe 8 years, it's been very obvious. And so people naturally reach back to the analogy of the 1940s, when the US and the Soviet Union were allies in the Second World War and then quickly ended up at loggerheads afterwards. The only problem with the Cold War analogy is that the US and the Soviet Union had, or the West, actually, the Western Europe and the US and the Soviet Union had almost no economic ties at all. So those two spheres that developed in the world were almost completely divorced from each other economically. But China is very different. So China is so integrated in the world economically that it becomes very difficult to imagine how you would have a strict analogy with the Cold War relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. So I think what you're more likely to have is a kind of pulling away from each other, but where you still have these economic strands going between each other. And ultimately, I think you could conceive of a situation where you had a sort of parallel economies, parallel supply chains, parallel tech standards. I mean, we're already kind of halfway down that road with the Chinese having a Great Firewall, and which within the Great Firewall, they've mirrored many of the companies that the US has here, like Google. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're also quite vulnerable to that because a lot of our high tech is made in China or made somewhere else. So if that supply chain were to be cut off, if relations got that bad, the US would be at a real disadvantage.
Well, I asked people in chat if anybody had one last question, and several people have replied. So we have, maybe we'll go back to someone who asked that. It was one question remaining from the beginning of the program. Meg, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing this right. Megana from PIA, thank you for this talk. Do you think the public perception that China has handled COVID-19 more successfully than other countries will offset Chinese citizens' dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the virus, such as the viral story of Dr. Li Wenlang's death?
So first of all, I have to say hi to Megana, and also to note that she is from Princeton in Asia. So I want to give a little plug. Any of you guys out there who are undergraduates and are interested in going to Asia, Princeton in Asia is open to all college graduates, doesn't have to be just Princeton. And they send about 50 or 60 recent college graduates every year to work in Asia or do teaching in Asia. And it's a terrific experience. So I highly recommend. So propaganda over. I think that yes, I mean, when you look at the responses coming out of China and coming out of people we know, you got a pretty sharp differential. So there's still a lot of anger in Wuhan over how the virus was handled, how the lockdown was handled. But that anger doesn't really translate in the rest of China, where people view it as having been an inconvenience, sure, but something that was necessary, and where basically the system worked pretty well. And now they're coming out of it, they're resuming daily life, the bars are starting to opening up again, the restaurants are opening. And so there's a feeling that they got through it and they took the necessary sacrifice and the result was worth it. So there's a real bifurcation of attitudes within China. And keep in mind also that I'm mostly talking about middle-class city attitudes. I think another really big question that we don't know is how this period of lockdown and how the future social controls going forward, how much that'll affect the migrant workers who really rely on mobility within China to make their living. And they've been nearly silent in this case, and they're not seen or heard nearly as much.
Well, I think this will have to be our last question, and I'm going to ask this one because I'm curious about the answer as well. It's from Bob. Have you heard from friends in Wuhan, and how is life post-COVID resuming?
Yeah, so Wuhan was the last to open up. So the rest of China was slowly loosening up while Wuhan was still on lockdown. Now they like to say it's back to normal. It's not totally back to normal, but it's much more normal than being locked in your house. So people can go out, they can go shopping, they can go to restaurants, they can start to travel to the rest of China. That was an important thing to remember. They were not allowed into the rest of China, but now, the roads are back open, the trains are starting to open up, the flights are opening. So there's a real sense that the lid got lifted off the pot and they can come out again, which I think, as those of us know who are stuck in our own houses, it's always such a relief to be able to walk out and feel normal again. So they're kind of the last ones out, but I think that they're very glad to be out.
Mm-hmm.
And I seem to have lost everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. And now we'll let Sadhana lead us out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. This was really, really insightful. And, there's so many, earlier on we had talked about, where are the facts, and thank you for just sharing a little bit of what really happened and what is happening and what the future might hold for us. So I'm so delighted to inform you that Lucy is going to return to campus when we can do this program in person as our Nosota lecturer. So we look forward to welcoming you back on campus and hope that day comes soon. So this has been a great presentation. And to all of you, I would love to ask you to take a minute to take our poll. This time it's just 2 small questions. And I thank you so much for joining us.